I was 20 years old the night my father threw $2 crumpled in my face and told me I was nothing. Even now, at 30, I can still feel the sting of that cheap paper on my cheek, as if the past refuses to loosen its grip. I remember the stunned silence around the Harrington Christmas table, the way relatives stopped mid-laugh, their forks frozen in the air. I remember the surprise that turned into laughter, then pity, then satisfaction. And I remember the look in my father's eyes as he pointed at me in front of everyone I'd ever known, cold, triumphant, relieved. Because humiliating me meant burying something else, something he'd been terrified I would uncover. He had no idea I was already holding the envelope that would destroy the version of the truth he'd fed me since childhood. I didn't know then either. But I felt a shift inside me that night, like something dormant cracked open. As the tree lights flickered across the long, polished table and the scent of cinnamon filled the room, I realized I wasn't just being thrown out of a family. I was being pushed toward answers no one wanted me to find. I stood now in my Portland office a decade later, staring out over the skyline as rain streaked down the glass. The city shimmered against the evening fog, but all I could think about was the past clawing its way back into my present. I had built a life here, an identity, a career, a version of myself untouched by the Harrington name. And yet, as Christmas approached, those old shadows crept in again, heavier than the storm pressing against the window. It always happened this time of year, a tightening in my chest, a pull toward memories I wished I had left buried. But this year felt different, more urgent. I sensed something shifting beneath the surface, some hidden thread tugging at everything I'd ever tried to hold together. My phone buzzed. A message from Jenna, my coworker. A reminder about the regional review meeting tomorrow. I texted back a quick acknowledgement, forcing myself to sound normal. Professional. Focused. The woman I had worked a decade to become. But my reflection in the window said otherwise, eyes tense, shoulders stiff. A ghost of the girl who once stood shaking in front of a room that decided she wasn't worth more than $2. I turned back to my desk where the folder lay, thin, innocent-looking, but brimming with dread. Earlier that afternoon, I'd been searching an archived drawer for a zoning file and stumbled upon it wedged behind a stack of outdated blueprints. A misfiled parcel record, my mother's handwriting in the corner, her initials, and something else, a date. One I immediately recognized, the week she died. I had felt the blood drain from my face, my hands trembling as I flipped through the pages. These weren't ordinary records. They referenced a coastal parcel my family had quietly owned for decades, a piece of land I'd always been told wasn't worth much. But the document said otherwise. Not only was the land valuable, it was entangled in a development plan launched years after my mother's death. Her notes were detailed, technical, alarmed. And then the pages abruptly ended. I couldn't breathe. I had slammed the folder shut, shoved it into my bag, and left the office without explanation. Now, hours later, I still hadn't fully processed what I'd found. My mother had never been careless. She documented everything meticulously. For her notes to end mid-analysis meant only one thing: someone had pulled pages out. And someone had put them back in the wrong place. Not destroyed, not hidden far away, just misplaced, overlooked, forgotten by whoever thought they'd erased the trail. A flash of anger flared in my chest, hot, bright, immediate. How many lies had been told to keep this quiet? How much of my life had been shaped by secrets I didn't even know existed? I sat down, opened the folder again, and forced myself to look at the first page. My mother's handwriting curved across the top margin, steady but firm. Risk assessment incomplete. Significant liability if ignored. Liability. The word felt like it detonated inside me. Liability meant danger. It meant responsibility. It meant someone had refused to listen to her. Someone like my father. I swallowed hard, feeling the old bitterness rise. 10 years. 10 long years since he'd thrown me out like trash, yelling that I was ungrateful, useless, dramatic, anything to shut me up. But this wasn't drama. This wasn't a daughter being too emotional. This was evidence. This was a warning. And something told me the missing pages held the part he never wanted me to see. My phone buzzed again. A second notification, but this time from an unknown number. Stop digging. The message was stark, cold, immediate. A chill slid through me, sharp as ice. No one outside Coastline Estates knew what I'd found. No one except maybe... My stomach tightened. No, he wouldn't. But the truth settled in my bones like a weight. Someone was watching. Someone who didn't want this uncovered. Someone who remembered the envelope I tried to give my father all those years ago. I closed the blinds, locked the office door, and slipped the folder into my coat. Whatever this was, it didn't belong here. It belonged with me. And I was done running from what they buried. The storm outside battered the windows, but for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of the past returning. I was ready to meet it. I didn't go straight home that night. Instead, I drove aimlessly through downtown Portland, letting the city lights smear into streaks against the wet windshield. My hands were tight on the wheel knuckles, pale the folder sitting on the passenger seat like a living thing breathing beside me. Every block I passed seemed to hum with the words in that text message. Stop digging. I replayed them over and over the same way I used to rehearse every insult my father hurled at me. But this message wasn't emotional cruelty or family spite. This was a warning from someone who knew I had touched something dangerous. And if someone wanted to scare me off, it meant there was more, so much more. When I finally pulled into my apartment garage, the cold hit me instantly, a slap of reality. I slung my bag over my shoulder, folded my coat tighter around me, and hurried toward the elevators. The garage felt too quiet, too hollow, the kind of silence that made you hear your heartbeat louder than your footsteps. As I reached the elevator door, the overhead light flickered. Once, twice, then steadied. I pressed the call button and waited. The doors slid open with their usual mechanical sigh, and I stepped inside, then froze. A piece of paper lay on the elevator floor, white, unmarked, folded neatly. It hadn't been there when I left that morning. I looked around. No movement, no cars passing, no shadows shifting. I bent down slowly and picked it up, pulse thundering in my ears. Inside, a single sentence in blocky printed font. This is not your fight. I felt the breath leave my chest. Not fear. Anger. Whoever sent this knew exactly where I lived, how close they could get. They wanted me. Rattled. Wanted me to retreat like before. But the part of me that used to shrink the girl who left her father's house with a burning cheek and a shaking heart wasn't here anymore. I stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for the 6th floor, and lifted my chin. If they expected me to fold, they didn't know me at all. Upstairs, the hallway was dim, the soft hum of the heater the only sound. I unlocked my door, slipped inside, and set the folder on the kitchen table. For a moment, I just stood there staring at it. My mother's handwriting, the coastal parcel, missing pages, board-level involvement, a warning strong enough to follow me home. What did you know, Mom? And what did it cost you? I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Walter Avery, the retired attorney who once handled environmental dispute cases for Coastline Estates. I hadn't spoken to him in years, not since I was an intern taking notes and shadowing compliance meetings. Back then, he had always treated me with a gentle, almost fatherly patience, offering advice my real father never cared to give. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the call button. It was late. Too late to call a man his age. But something in my chest urged me forward. I pressed dial. The phone rang 3 times before a groggy voice answered. Claire Walter. I'm sorry for calling so late. Something happened today. Something I need your help with. His tone sharpened immediately. Are you safe? I think so. I paced the living room, rubbing my forehead. I found old parcel documents, my mother's notes. They shouldn't have been in the archive drawer, and some pages are missing. Silence on the other line. Heavy. Not confused. Silence. Fearful silence. Claire, he finally said, voice low. You need to stay away from that case. There were disagreements at the top. It was complicated. People were upset. Pressured. It's best not to reopen it. Pressured by whom? My voice tightened. Another long pause. Then he exhaled a tired, defeated sound. I can't talk about this over the phone. Come to my office tomorrow morning. Early. Before anyone else gets in. I swallowed. Walter. Someone left a note at my apartment. That seemed to knock the breath from him. When he spoke again, his voice trembled. Then you need to be careful. Very careful. Don't tell anyone else. Don't bring anyone with you. And Claire, yes, don't bring the original documents. Copies only, understand? My stomach dropped. Why? Because if what your mother wrote is what I think it is, people will go far to keep it quiet. When we hung up, I stood there in the silence of my apartment, stunned. He didn't ask what the documents were. He didn't ask which project. He didn't even pretend not to know. He already knew. I grabbed pens, sticky notes, and my scanner. I spent the next hour copying every page, saving digital versions in multiple drives, and hiding the originals in the back of my bedroom safe. With each page I scanned, my mother's voice grew louder in my head. Her cautious tone, her meticulous habits, her warnings about the power people would wield to protect themselves. When I finally sat down exhausted, I opened the folder again. A small, faded scribble I'd missed before caught my eye, just a corner note on the first page in my mother's writing. Meeting above my pay grade today. Franklin left angry. Something bigger brewing. Franklin. The same Franklin Shore who chaired our legal division now, whose signature was on dozens of project approvals, and whose name had been whispered too often in conversations over the years to be coincidence. My apartment felt suddenly smaller, tighter, as if the walls were listening. I closed the folder, exhaled slowly, and whispered into the quiet, "Okay, Mom. I'm listening now." Tomorrow I would face Walter. I would hear what he'd been afraid to say, and I would finally begin to understand the truth buried beneath my family's past. One thing was certain. The deeper I went, the more I realized this wasn't simply about land. It was about the kind of truth people kill to protect. The next morning I arrived at Walter's office before the sun had even lifted itself over the Portland skyline. The air was sharp metallic, the kind that filled your lungs with a quiet ache. I parked on the street rather than in the lot. Something instinctual warned me not to make my presence obvious. When I stepped onto the sidewalk, the city still felt half asleep, lights blinking lazily in windows, a thin mist twisting between the buildings. Walter's firm occupied a small converted brick house tucked between a bakery and a bike repair shop. I had always found it charming in its way, like the last remnant of an older, gentler Portland. Today, however, something in the stillness around it made my skin prickle. I knocked softly, expecting to wait, but the door creaked open almost immediately. Walter stood there in a wrinkled sweater vest, hair uncombed, eyes troubled in a way that made my stomach tighten. "Claire," he said, voice thin. "Come in." Inside the office smelled faintly of old books and the cheap instant coffee he insisted tasted better than any fancy brew. Law journals stacked in precarious towers lined the walls. Nothing had changed except the tension that clung to him. He locked the door behind us. "You didn't bring the originals, did you?" he asked. "No, copies only. Like you said." He nodded with visible relief, then motioned to his desk. "Show me." I placed the copies in front of him, watching his fingers tremble as he flipped through the pages. He recognized my mother's handwriting immediately. His shoulders slumped, grief brushing across his face like a shadow. "Eleanor," he whispered almost to himself. She was stubborn to the end. My throat tightened. Walter, what did she uncover? He shut his eyes for a long moment, then gestured for me to sit. "Before I tell you anything, there are things you need to understand. Your mother wasn't just documenting erosion risks. She was documenting a liability crisis, one that threatened people with far more influence than she realized." Who? I pressed. He hesitated, gaze drifting to the window as if searching for watchers. The upper leadership at Coastline Estates, not just Franklin. Others above him. The words hit like a physical blow. Above Franklin. That doesn't make sense. In the files I saw, he was the signing officer. Walter shook his head. He signed what he was told to sign. He was ambitious, yes, but the decisions you're looking at. He tapped the documents. They came from the level above the board, people tied to private investors, debt holders, and partnership contracts you wouldn't recognize. I felt my heartbeat hammering in my throat. Then why did my mother get involved at all? Because she found proof, he answered. Hard proof that parts of the coastal parcel were geologically unsound. If developed, the cliffs would collapse. The liability would have crippled the company. And instead of stopping the project, I said slowly, they tried to silence her. He didn't correct me. The air grew heavier. "Walter," I whispered, "did you know she was in danger?" He rubbed a trembling hand across his face. I suspected. She came to me one evening weeks before she died. She said someone from the executive suite had confronted her directly about her findings. She didn't name who, just that she didn't feel safe anymore. My fingers curled into fists. "And what did you do?" "What?" "I could," he said quietly. "I told her to report it outside the company." But she hesitated. "She wanted to protect you." A lump rose in my throat. Protect me from what? He looked at me, then eyes soft with sorrow. "From your father's involvement." The room spun for a moment. I swallowed hard. My father didn't even care about the land. He barely cared about Claire. Walter leaned forward. Martin wasn't the mastermind, but he was pressured, influenced. He participated in meetings he shouldn't have. He signed non-disclosures, and he kept things from your mother because he believed it would keep the family intact. Family. The word scraped through me. I couldn't breathe. "Tell me the truth," I said. "All of it." Walter exhaled slowly. "Your mother was preparing to escalate her report beyond Coastline Estates. Someone found out. There were attempts to intimidate her, anonymous calls, cars tailing her. She showed me a note once slipped under her windshield wiper. Said only one thing. Stop. The same word someone had sent me. She was frightened," he continued. "But she refused to let the truth be buried. She gave me a sealed envelope and told me to keep it safe. I never opened it. I don't even know if it still exists. Why didn't you tell me this years ago?" My voice cracked. "Your father asked me not to. He said exposing the past would only cause more harm." Anger surged through me so quickly I felt heat rise behind my eyes. More harm than her death. More harm than him throwing me out of the family. Walter winced. "Claire." I stood abruptly pacing the office. The walls felt too close, the air too thick. "So what now?" I asked. "What am I supposed to do with this?" He hesitated again. "Leave it alone." "No," I snapped. "I'm serious, Claire," he said. "You don't know the people involved. You don't know how far this goes or how desperate they are." Eleanor underestimated them. Don't make the same mistake. I stopped moving, staring at him. "Someone followed me last night," I said softly. "Someone watched me. And this morning, the archive drawer where I first found these documents was empty." Walter's face drained of color. "They're tracking your movements." "Yes," I whispered. So tell me, why now? Why send threats after 10 years? He pressed his lips together, then whispered, because something must have changed. Someone must be afraid you're close to finding something your mother left behind. A chill ran through me. What's something I don't know? He whispered. But if she hid it, it's still out there, and they know it. The room fell silent. When I left the office, the sun had barely risen yet the world already felt darker. My breath fogged in the cold air as I stepped onto the sidewalk, clutching the folder to my chest. I thought I'd come here for clarity. Instead, I walked away with something far heavier. A direction. A threat. A truth that had survived 10 years of silence. I didn't know where the trail would lead next, but I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't turning back. The threatening text echoed in my mind as I drove home from Walter's office, the winter sky, a flat sheet of gray pressing low over Portland. I kept checking my rearview mirror, telling myself I was imagining things, that the dark SUV behind me had been there only by coincidence. But every time I slowed, it slowed. When I switched lanes, it drifted just enough to stay aligned, a shadow that refused to detach itself from mine. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex, my pulse was a steady drumbeat in my throat. I parked beneath a flickering light, sat still, and waited. The SUV didn't enter the garage. Instead, it glided past the entrance, then disappeared behind the corner as if it had somewhere else to be. As if it had seen enough. Upstairs, the hallway seemed too quiet. When I reached my door, I noticed the small patterned rug outside my unit was slightly crooked. It didn't prove anything, not really, but I knew how I left things. I unlocked the door, carefully scanning the room before stepping inside. Nothing looked disturbed. Nothing felt right. When I walked to the mailbox slot inside my door, a thin white envelope slid halfway through, caught my eye. No stamp, no address. Hand delivered. My breath caught. I eased it free and unfolded the paper. A photograph fell into my hand. Me walking out of Walter's office less than an hour ago. My expression tense, unaware. The image had been taken from a distance, grainy but unmistakable. On the back, written in thick red ink, "Last warning." The words hit harder than fear, they landed like a prophecy. This wasn't random intimidation. Someone was tracking me in real time. Someone with access. Someone who knew exactly what I was digging into. I sat at my kitchen table, laid the photo beside my mother's copied documents, and forced myself to breathe. One breath, then another. Panic wouldn't help. Fear wouldn't protect me. So I focused on what I had, what I knew, what I could control. I needed perspective. A second mind. And the only one I trusted, even marginally, was Jenna. I called her, trying to steady my voice. "Hey, quick question. Who handles corporate security for the executive wing?" She paused, caught off guard. Depends on what you mean. For events, it's usually external hires. But for day-to-day, Franklin uses a private internal team. They answer directly to him. My grip tightened on the phone. Internal like personal. Pretty much. Claire. Why did something happen? I forced a small laugh. Just curious. Thanks. But Jenna wasn't stupid. She heard the strain in my tone. Be careful, she added quietly. People in this building play dirtier than you think. When we hung up, my gaze drifted to the jacket I'd seen draped over a chair in Walter's office, the day before, the slanted lightning bolt emblem stitched onto the sleeve. I'd assumed it belonged to a client or someone from the legal department. Now I knew better. Franklin's private security. The pieces clicked together with frightening clarity. They had been watching me, following me, delivering threats to my apartment door. This wasn't just a corporate risk issue, this was personal. I pulled the saved documents closer and began spreading them out across the table. The pages were faded in some places, smudged in others, but the meaning was unmistakable. Notes on erosion levels, irregularities in soil compaction, letters drafted to regulatory agencies that were never sent. and there barely visible in a faint pencil impression left on a missing sheet were the words liability undisclosed, followed by criminal exposure. My stomach twisted. Someone had tried to erase the trail, but paper had memory. It remembered what fingers pressed into it. I traced the indentations, slowly feeling the ghost of my mother's urgency. This wasn't a technical dispute. This was a cover-up. One with legal consequences severe enough to destroy careers, maybe even land people in prison. Which meant whoever threatened her had every reason to threaten me. I needed to see the land for myself. To understand what she saw. To understand why she was silenced. I pulled up maps on my laptop, zooming into satellite images of the coastal parcel. The jagged cliffs, the unstable slopes, the erosion scars that looked deeper than any report had ever admitted. The land wasn't just risky, it was dangerous, just like the truth surrounding it. A soft thud outside broke my focus. I walked quietly to the window, parted the blinds with 2 fingers. A black SUV idled across the street, headlights off. A man leaned against the hood, the glow of a cigarette briefly illuminating his face. He was wearing the same style jacket I'd seen at Walter's. Without fully thinking, I grabbed my coat and stepped into the hallway. Before fear could stop me, I headed outside. The cold hit me instantly, biting through my sleeves. The man looked up as I approached, smoke sliding from his lips. "Why are you following me?" I demanded. He didn't flinch. "You're opening files that were meant to stay sealed. My mother died for those files," I shot back. He took a slow drag, exhaled. Exactly. That single word chilled me deeper than the winter air. "What does Franklin want?" I asked. His brow twitched. Not fear, not guilt, but something like pity. "Franklin isn't the one you should be afraid of." I stepped closer. "Then who is?" He dropped his cigarette and crushed it with his boot. "People above him. People who won't warn you twice." "Too late," I whispered. "I'm already in this." He studied me a moment, then shook his head. "Then start choosing your steps carefully, Claire. You're walking a line your mother didn't survive." When he stepped back into the SUV and drove off, the night seemed to close around me, thick and suffocating. But beneath the fear, beneath the dread, something else burned hotter. Resolve. They wanted me silent. They wanted me scared. But all they'd done was remind me of the one truth I couldn't ignore. My mother didn't die because she was wrong. She died because she was right. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother's handwriting, the red ink on the back of the photograph, and the man's cigarette glowing in the dark. By sunrise, my chest felt bruised from hours of shallow breaths. But one thing had settled solidly inside me. I needed to see the land. Not the sanitized reports, not the doctored photographs. The real place, the cliffs, the soil, the erosion my mother had warned about. I had to stand where she once stood and see what she saw before everything went wrong. I packed a small bag, grabbed a rental car from a lot downtown, and headed south along the Oregon Coast Highway. The morning fog clung to the treetops like wet wool, and the ocean roared faintly in the distance. Every mile I drove, the tension in my spine tightened, not fear, but purpose sharpening itself. 3 hours in, I turned off onto a gravel road that wound toward the development site. A faded construction sign lay crooked on the ground, half buried in mud. No workers, no equipment running, just an empty silence stretching over raw, exposed earth. I stepped out of the car into the cold wind. The air smelled like salt and damp soil, almost metallic. The cliffs loomed ahead, jagged and uneven. When I walked closer, my foot sank deeper than expected. The ground felt unstable, soft in all the wrong places. Just like she described. I crouched down, scooping a handful of dark powder-fine earth. It crumbled instantly between my fingers, lighter than it should have been. This wasn't soil ready for foundation. This was a landslide waiting to happen. Off to the left, I saw a set of rusted stakes hammered into the ground, marking the boundary of Phase 2, the expansion project I'd never been allowed to touch. Sheets of old plastic fluttered from the stakes like torn flags. My mother had stood here. She had noticed the cracks in the ridge, the shift in sediment, the moisture levels that didn't match the official records. And instead of being thanked, she had been pushed into silence. I walked further, and at the edge of the site, I found it. A collapse. The earth had sheared away, leaving a deep scar down the cliffside. Fresh erosion. The same kind my mother had written warnings about. The same type that killed 2 construction workers in the freak accident 3 years ago. Except this wasn't freak. This was negligence. I took photos, angles, measurements, the depth of the erosion, the soil texture. Then I pulled out my notebook and sketched the slope structure just like she used to teach me when I was young. Document everything. Trust the land to tell the truth. I had just finished when a sound cut through the wind, a low crunch of gravel. A dark SUV rolled slowly toward me. My heart lurched. Not again. A man stepped out. Not the smoker from the night before. This one was clean-cut, wearing a heavy black coat and sunglasses despite the gray sky. "Claire Hart," he called. I didn't answer. My legs tensed, ready to run if I had to. He lifted both hands slightly. "I'm not here to threaten you." "Then why are you here?" I kept a firm grip on my phone. "To warn you," he said simply. "You're not supposed to be on this property. I'm investigating my mother's work." His jaw tightened. "And that's exactly why you're in danger." For a moment, the only sound between us was the wind scraping across the exposed ground. "Did Franklin send you?" I demanded. He hesitated just enough to tell me the answer before he even spoke. "No. But he knows you're here." I took a small step back. "So what do you want from me to get you off this land alive?" The words hung heavy in the cold air. "What do you mean, alive?" He looked past me to the unstable cliffs. "This area isn't monitored anymore. No reinforcement, no safety inspections. If there's another collapse, no one's liable, no one responsible. And if someone wanted to ensure you didn't poke around..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. For the first time since beginning this investigation, true fear crept up my spine, not just of being watched, not just of being threatened, but of how easy it would be for a tragic accident to happen here. I swallowed hard. "Why are you telling me this?" He lowered his voice. "Because your mother..." She wasn't wrong. And not everyone agreed with how things were handled after her death. "Are you saying you knew her?" My throat tightened. He didn't answer. His silence was enough. A gust of wind swept across the cliff, scattering loose dirt. He stepped closer. "Leave this place, Claire. Gather your evidence, but don't come back alone. They won't give you another chance." A radio crackled inside his SUV. He stiffened, shot a quick glance over his shoulder, then murmured, "Please, go." Then he climbed back into the vehicle and drove off without another word. I stood alone in the wind, the cliffs groaning softly beneath me, the ocean snarling below. My hands trembled as I gathered my notes and backed away from the edge. I had proof, physical evidence of danger, signs of a deliberate cover-up. But I also had confirmation of something far larger. Someone else knew the truth. Someone inside the company. And someone else wanted it buried forever. As I got into my car and slammed the door, one thought repeated in my mind like a heartbeat. My mother didn't fall victim to an accident. She fell victim to a war I had just stepped into. I drove back toward Portland with the cliffs still haunting the edges of my vision, the way the soil crumbled under my fingers, replaying again and again. Every piece of evidence I had gathered filled me with purpose, yet underneath it ran a pulse of fear I couldn't ignore. Whoever the man on site had been, his warning, "Leave this place alive," echoed louder than the rushing coastline. By the time I reached the city, the winter sky had thickened into heavy clouds. I pulled into my apartment garage, collected the folders and photos, and headed upstairs. But as soon as I entered my unit, something felt wrong. A subtle shift in the air. The faint smell of cologne, one I didn't wear. I scanned the living room, a cushion slightly askew. A stack of mail on the kitchen counter moved from one side to the other, and on my coffee table placed neatly at the center was a single business card. Black matte, embossed silver lettering. Franklin Hale, Chief Operating Officer, Redwood Development Group. My stomach tightened. He had been here. Not security, not a hired messenger. Him. The man who once told my mother she was becoming problematic. The man who signed off on every expansion she protested. The man who shut down every inquiry after she died. On the back of the card was a handwritten note. "We need to chat. Tonight. Do not bring anyone." My heart hammered, but beneath the panic was a rising wave of fury. He wasn't hiding anymore. He wasn't threatening from the shadows. He was stepping directly into the light. I grabbed my coat and left the apartment before fear convinced me otherwise. Franklin had written an address, a private club downtown known for expensive wine and closed-door conversations that were never meant to be recorded. I drove there through rain that streaked the windshield like silver needles. Inside, soft jazz floated through the dim space. Men in tailored suits murmured over crystal glasses. Nobody paid attention to me as the hostess led me to a room in the back, a private booth with velvet curtains and a single lamp casting a warm glow. Franklin was already there. Tall, immaculate, his white hair slicked back, a glass of bourbon in hand. He greeted me with a smile that felt like a blade. "Claire," he said smoothly, "you look tired." I sat without returning the smile. "You broke into my home." He lifted his glass. "I visited. I don't break into anything. That's for criminals. You left a threat on my table." "That wasn't a threat. It was an invitation." His eyes glinted. A warning would look very different. I forced myself not to flinch. "What do you want?" He leaned back, studying me like a scientist observing an experiment he already knew the result of. "You're digging into matters far above your pay grade," he said softly. "And certainly above your mother's. She died because of what she found." His jaw twitched, the first crack in his polished facade. "Your mother was a talented woman, but she didn't understand the scale of what she was involved in." "No," I said, leaning forward. "She understood it too well." His lips curled. There were investors, federal contracts, international partners, billions on the line, and one geologist who raised concerns was not going to stop an empire in the making. I felt my pulse throb in my neck. "So you silenced her?" He didn't answer. But silence is an answer. He lifted his glass again. "I am here, Claire, to offer you something your mother was too stubborn to accept." I felt a chill. "And what's that?" "A way out." My breath hitched. "Out of what?" "Out of this unfortunate path you've taken." He reached into his briefcase and placed a folder on the table. A position at corporate headquarters, a generous salary, full relocation, and a non-disclosure agreement. My voice was barely audible. "You want to buy me? I want to protect the company," he corrected. "And you. Because the next step you take will determine whether you have a future or a tragedy." He said the word tragedy with chilling ease as if discussing weather patterns. "What happened to my mother?" I asked. Franklin's gaze darkened. She stood in the way of inevitability. The cliff was unstable. It was an accident waiting to happen. We told her to step back. She didn't. A lie so cleanly spoken it left no fingerprints. I let out a shaking breath. "I'm not signing anything." He sighed, almost disappointed. "I was afraid you'd say that." He slid another paper toward me, a photograph of me at the development site earlier that day, standing near the precipice. "I heard that section has gotten even more unstable. One good storm could send the whole ridge collapsing onto the beach." I stared at him, horrified. "Are you threatening to kill me?" "No," he said calmly. "I'm telling you that dangerous places are unpredictable." Rage surged through me so hot it felt like electricity. My mother's death wasn't an accident. He didn't deny it. He simply rose, placed a crisp napkin over the untouched bourbon glass, and buttoned his coat. "Think carefully, Claire," he said as he passed me. "Some stories are better left buried, especially the ones written on landslide soil." When he left the booth, my hands were trembling not from fear, but from the clarity settling like stone in my gut. Franklin had just confirmed everything, and he had no idea what he'd awakened. I folded the photograph he'd given me and slipped it into my pocket. His threats, his offer, his arrogance, every piece would become evidence. He thought he was closing a door. He didn't realize he had just opened the one that would destroy him. And for the first time since the investigation began, I felt something close to calm. If they wanted war, they would have it. I left the club with the cold January air hitting my face like a slap. My hands were still trembling when I reached my car, but not from fear anymore. The fury pulsing in my veins kept me warm, kept me focused. Franklin thought he had intimidated me into silence. Instead, he had given me the last piece I needed, a confession wrapped in arrogance. But I couldn't win this war alone. I drove straight to Jenna's apartment. Her building was lit with soft yellow lights against the dark sky, and when she opened the door, her eyes widened at the sight of me. "Claire, you look pale. What happened?" I brushed past her into the living room, pacing once before stopping. "I need your help." She closed the door gently and turned toward me, brows furrowing. "What did you do?" "Nothing," I said. "But I found the development site, and Franklin knows." Her lips parted in shock. He knows you went out there. He approached me tonight." Jenna sank onto her sofa. "Claire, he's dangerous. Whatever he said, he admitted everything I cut in. He admitted there were investors, pressures, that my mom was in the way, and then he offered me a job to disappear." Jenna covered her mouth with her hand. "Oh my God!" I sat across from her, leaning forward. "You told me before that the company files were incomplete, that something was missing." Her eyes flicked to the side, guilt shadowing her features. "I didn't want to drag you deeper." "You didn't," I said softly. "Franklin did." She let out a long, shaky breath. "There are internal audits, ones not shared with the research department. They're stored in a restricted database, executive level only. Can you access them?" "No," she whispered. "But I know who can." She hesitated. I waited. Finally, she said, "Evan. From data compliance. He has full clearance. And he owes me." I didn't ask why. I didn't care. "Will he help?" "If I ask the right way," she murmured. I nodded. "Then we need him. Tonight." Jenna stood, grabbed her coat, and tossed me mine. "Let's go before I lose my nerve." The drive downtown was silent, but tense headlights streaking over wet pavement. Evan lived in a narrow apartment above a guitar shop. He answered after 3 knocks, his hair, messy eyes bleary behind thick glasses. "Jenna." He blinked. "It's 10 at night." She pushed past him gently. "We need your access." His confusion sharpened into suspicion. "This is about the Redwood project." I stepped forward. "My mother's death." His eyes widened as he looked between us. "I don't want trouble." "You already have trouble," Jenna said. "Everyone inside knows the soil assessments were staged. You think the board won't come after compliance when this collapses?" Evan stiffened. "No one is supposed to know about that." "Well, I do," I said, "and I need proof." He swallowed hard. "If I access restricted archives, they'll trace it. They'll fire me. Or worse." I pulled the photograph Franklin gave me from my pocket, the one taken at the development site. Evan's breath caught when he saw it. "They're watching you already," he whispered. "Yes," I said. "And if I stop now, I'm next. Just like my mom." Evan's shoulders sagged. He turned toward his desk, powering on his computer. "I can try, but I'm not promising anything." Jenna exhaled shakily beside me. For the next hour, the three of us hovered around his screen as he dug through encrypted layers, bypassing internal firewalls, muttering curses under his breath. Each click felt like a drumbeat toward the truth. There, he finally said, "Executive Audit Level 3. He tapped the archive. A folder tree expanded. Internal Liability Assessments. Environmental Risk Reports. Incident. Suppression Logs. Anonymous. Employee Complaints. Fatality Review. Redwood Site. Sensitive. I felt my throat tighten. The last file bore a date 6 months before my mother died. "Open it," I whispered. Evan clicked. A PDF loaded onto the screen. The first page was stark clinical. Fatality Review Summary. Event Classification. Preventable Cause. Ground Failure. Negligence. Liability. Extreme Risk to Project Continuation. High. Recommended Action. Immediate Suspension of Activities. Primary Reporter. Dr. Elise Warren. My heart slammed against my ribs. She filed this. I breathed. Jenna squeezed my arm. "Claire." "Scroll?" I said. More pages. Photos of the same collapse site. Soil samples. Depth reports. Geotechnical comparisons. Then employee death report name. Thomas Riker. Occupation Field Technician Summary. Fatal fall due to ridge collapse following unapproved drilling. My vision blurred. My mother had reported this. She had warned them again, and someone buried it. At the bottom of the document was a signature line. Incident Reviewed by Franklin Hale. Status: Sealed, Restricted Access. My breath froze inside my lungs. He knew there had been a fatality. He hid it. And 6 months later, my mother fell. My hands shook so hard Jenna steadied them. Evan looked at me with quiet horror. "This file alone," he whispered, "could take the whole company down. Franklin, the board, the investors, everyone." "Keep downloading," I said. "Anything with my mother's name. Anything with site incidents, complaints, cover-ups." As the files transferred, Evan looked at me with fear and admiration tangled on his face. "You're really going to take them on?" I met his eyes. "They killed my mother," I said, "and they think they can scare me away. But I'm done being scared." The next moment, Evan's computer pinged 3 times. We all froze. Unauthorized access detected, user alert, executive override, initiated traceback requested. Evan paled. "They know someone's inside the file." "Shut it down," Jenna hissed. He yanked the power cord. The screen went black. For a moment, no one breathed. Then the lights in Evan's apartment flickered once, twice. A car engine revved outside. I moved to the window slowly. A black SUV waited at the curb, headlights off. Watching. Waiting. "We need to go," I whispered. "Now." And as we slipped into the night with stolen files in my bag and danger closing in fast, I realized something with absolute clarity. Franklin wasn't afraid of my mother's report. He was terrified of what I would do with it. The 3 of us barely spoke as we hurried down the stairwell, each step echoing like a countdown. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out everything except the awareness of danger closing in. When we reached the ground floor, I peered through the glass door. The black SUV remained parked at the curb, engine humming softly, exhaust rising in faint white wisps. The silhouette of a man sat behind the wheel, unmoving, watching the entrance like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Jenna whispered, "Claire, what are we going to do?" I tightened my grip on my bag. The files inside felt heavier than bricks. "We leave through the back." "Evan, grab your laptop." He hesitated. "If they saw the access alert, they'll assume I was the one who pulled the files." "They already suspect you," I said gently. "But right now they want me." His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. We slipped into the alley behind the building. The rain had picked up, turning the narrow passage into a glistening ribbon of asphalt. My car was 2 blocks away. If we moved fast, we might get there before the SUV realized we'd escaped. But the moment we turned the corner, I knew the night had other plans. Another SUV idled near the intersection. Jenna grabbed my arm. "They're flanking the building." Evan's voice trembled. "This is bad. Really bad." My mind raced. We needed a safe place somewhere off the grid, somewhere Franklin couldn't reach us immediately. And suddenly a memory flashed in my mind, my mother's old storage unit tucked behind an abandoned strip mall on the east side of the city. Nobody knew about it except me. "We're going to my mother's storage," I said. Jenna blinked. "What?" "Why?" "Because if they corner us, they'll take the files. And if they take the files, everything ends." I pulled them toward my car, keeping to the shadows, until we were close enough to sprint. The SUVs stayed in their positions, they hadn't noticed us yet. When we reached my car, I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking. The engine roared to life just as one of the SUVs turned sharply, headlights sweeping across parked cars. They saw us. Evan whispered. "Seat belts," I muttered, then floored the accelerator. Tires screeched as we shot out of the parking spot and onto the street. The SUV lurched forward after us, gaining speed. Rain smeared across the windshield as the wipers fought to keep up. My heart hammered. Every instinct told me to run faster, turn harder, push the car to its limits. "Claire, they're right behind us," Jenna shouted. "I see them." I swerved left, cutting down an empty side street. The SUV followed like a shadow. We tore through Portland's grid of industrial lots and warehouses, weaving between buildings until we finally reached the outskirts of the old strip mall. The lot was dark, half the lampposts burned out, the other half flickering like dying stars. I parked behind the dumpsters. "Move," I whispered urgently, "before they catch up." We ran to the rusted gate behind the abandoned nail salon. My fingers shook as I punched in the old code, my birthday. The lock clicked open. Inside the narrow corridor of storage units, the air smelled of dust and cold concrete. I led them to Unit 47 and forced the door open. The light flickered on, revealing a cramped space filled with old geology equipment boxes of field notes and a metal filing cabinet covered in stickers my mother had collected. Evan stared around in disbelief. She kept everything. "Yes," I murmured. "Everything they wanted erased." We rushed to the cabinet. I pulled open the top drawer, rifling through notebooks filled with soil analysis and environmental surveys. Then I found a binder with a cracked spine labeled Redwood Phase 3. My throat tightened. This is her final report. Jenna opened it and gasped softly. Charts, maps, erosion patterns, risk projections far more detailed than the files Evan had pulled. She knew, Jenna whispered. She knew the entire region was unstable. And she knew they were lying about the measurements. Evan sat on an old stool, his face pale. "This is enough to trigger a federal investigation." I nodded slowly. "But only if we survive long enough to submit it." We fell silent. The rain hammered the corrugated metal roof. Somewhere outside, a car door slammed. Jenna's eyes widened. They found us. I motioned for them to get behind the shelves. My heart pounded so loud I feared it would give us away. Footsteps approached, slow, deliberate, echoing down the corridor. "Claire," Evan whispered, barely audible. I steeled myself. The footsteps stopped right outside Unit 47. A shadow moved under the door. I held my breath. Then 3 sharp knocks, each one heavy enough to rattle the thin metal. We froze. A man's voice drifted through the door, calm and unhurried. "Claire, we know you're in there. Open the door." Jenna clapped a hand over her mouth. I didn't respond. Another pause. Then even softer. "Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." My pulse spiked. They were seconds away from breaking in. I scanned the walls frantically, searching for anything, an alternate exit, a vent, a window. But it was a storage unit. A box with one way in and one way out. And they were blocking it. The man outside sighed as if disappointed. "All right," he said. "Have it your way." Metal scraped against metal, someone sliding a tool into the lock. Panic flooded through me. Then my gaze landed on something on the top shelf, a hatch. A maintenance access panel, small but big enough to crawl through. I pointed upward. There. Go. Now. Jenna and Evan scrambled onto the shelves as the lock groaned under force. I followed, clutching my bag and the binder tight. Evan pushed the hatch open, revealing a narrow crawl space above the unit. Voices outside grew louder. "Hurry," I whispered. As we pulled ourselves into the dark space, the unit door cracked inward with a metallic shriek. I looked down one last time as flashlights sliced through the shadows below. They were in, and we were barely out. I pulled the hatch closed just as the men flooded into the unit. My lungs burned, but my mind had never been clearer. They wanted to corner us, but they had just pushed me into the one place they feared most: the truth. The crawl space above the storage units was barely high enough to crouch, the ceiling sloping so low I had to keep my head ducked to avoid hitting exposed beams. Dust floated in the stale air, illuminated only by the thin line of light coming through the cracks in the hatch. Below us, flashlights cut across the unit beams, skittering over metal shelves and boxes. Boots scraped the concrete floor. Jenna pressed a hand over her mouth, her breaths shallow and trembling. Evan crawled ahead, moving slowly, carefully, trying not to make the old sheet metal groan under our weight. I kept one hand on the floor to steady myself, and the other tightly around my bag of documents, feeling the curve of the binder pressing into my ribs. Voices drifted up from beneath us. "She's not here. Search everything. The files, too." They had to take something. Another voice, more impatient: "Franklin wants results tonight." I clenched my jaw. Franklin wasn't just covering up negligence. He was hunting us to erase the truth. And he had men so willing to follow orders it made my blood run cold. We crawled forward through the narrow channel. The crawl space stretched across the entire row of units, connecting them through a low, rusted metal grid. It was supposed to be for maintenance workers, never intended for escape. The metal creaked beneath us with every movement. I froze more than once, waiting for the sound below to change, for footsteps to rush our way. But their attention stayed in Unit 47. For now. After what felt like an eternity, Evan whispered, "There's a vent ahead. It might lead outside." Might. But might was better than waiting to be dragged out by Franklin's men. We continued crawling. My palms burned from friction. Dust stuck to my sweat-dampened skin. My knees knocked into pipes and bolts. The metal trembled with each shift. At the end of the passageway, a small vent was secured with 2 screws. Evan tried twisting them with his fingers, but they barely budged. "Move," I said. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small multi-tool, my mother's. She'd kept it in her field kit at all times. I flicked out the screwdriver and went to work, praying the metal wouldn't shriek too loudly. Each turn felt painfully slow. Below us, muffled shouts echoed. Something clattered. A shelf overturned. Then boots moving again. Toward the back units. Franklin's men were expanding their search. "Hurry," Jenna breathed beside me. I twisted the final screw free. The vent cover dropped away silently into the dark. Cold air rushed in. A narrow drop of maybe 4 feet opened onto the backside of the strip mall, where only dumpsters and tall grass hid the cracked pavement. We slid out one by one. Jenna went first, landing with a soft grunt. Evan followed. When my feet hit the ground, my knees nearly buckled with relief. Until headlights swept across the far end of the lot. My stomach lurched. Another SUV turned in. "They're circling," Evan whispered. We ducked behind the nearest dumpster. The smell of rotting cardboard and mildew was overwhelming, but we didn't move. The SUV slowed, prowling like an animal scenting prey. My phone buzzed inside my pocket. I nearly leapt out of my skin. I fumbled it out, silenced it, and glanced at the screen. A blocked number. A voicemail notification. Cold dread crept down my spine. We waited until the SUV moved on, looping around toward the main lot. When its lights finally faded, I motioned for the others to follow me across the overgrown ditch behind the building. Branches snagged at our clothes as we scrambled up the opposite side. On the other end was an empty road leading toward the industrial district. "We need a safer place," Jenna said softly. "My apartment is compromised," I murmured. "Yours too, now that they saw us together." Evan pushed his glasses up, breath fogging in the cold. "I have a friend with an office downtown. Private security, cameras, somewhere we can hide for a few hours." I nodded. "Lead the way." We jogged through the darkness, keeping to alleys until we reached the main road. Once we were far enough from the strip mall, I finally allowed myself to check the voicemail. I pressed play. Static crackled. Then a voice, smooth, cold, unmistakable. "Claire, what you're doing is reckless. Franklin, you think running will save you. You're only delaying the inevitable." My grip tightened on the phone. "Your mother made the same mistake." A pause. A deliberate, cruel pause. "And you already know how that ended." The voicemail ended. I felt the world tilt, my breath catching in my throat. Every old wound reopened. Every memory of the night my mother died surged forward: the phone call, the rushed investigation, the way nobody looked me in the eye when they said the word accident. Jenna touched my arm gently. "Claire." "I'm fine," I said, though my voice shook. But I wasn't fine. I was burning. We reached Evan's friend's office, a quiet building with tinted windows and a keypad lock. Inside the lobby, lights glowed dimly and security cameras blinked overhead. For the first time in hours, I felt a small measure of safety. We settled in a conference room, closing the blinds and locking the door. Evan set up his laptop. Jenna organized the files on the table, and I finally exhaled long enough to think. I laid out everything we had: internal audits, fatality reports, my mother's binder, photos of the erosion, notes about the cover-up. Evan looked at me with a mixture of awe and fear. "This isn't just corporate misconduct," he whispered. "This is criminal. If we take this to federal regulators or the press, it will blow up the entire company." "Which is why Franklin is willing to risk everything to stop us," I said. "And why he won't stop," Jenna added quietly. I leaned back in my chair, heart still pounding. "They destroyed my mother," I murmured. "They stole her life, her work, her truth. And they think they can bury me too." Jenna placed her hand over mine. "They can't. Not anymore. You're not alone in this." Evan nodded. "We'll help you finish what she started." For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the weight shift, not disappear, but redistribute, shared across 3 sets of shoulders instead of 1. The fear was still there. The danger was real. But so was our resolve. My voice steadied as I spoke the words that had been forming since the cliffs, since the storage unit, since Franklin dared to threaten me face to face. "We bring this into the light," I said. "We expose everything." The room fell into determined silence. Tomorrow, we would go to war. And for the first time, I had allies. By morning, the city looked deceptively calm beneath a pale winter sky. Frost clung to the edges of office windows, and the streets were still quiet as commuters trickled into the day. But inside the small conference room where we had taken refuge, tension sat thick in the air like smoke. Evan typed furiously, backing up every file onto encrypted drives, while Jenna and I organized the documents into chronological order. Photos, reports, internal logs, every piece of the puzzle that proved Redwood had buried fatal risks and deaths. The scope of the cover-up grew clearer with each passing minute. At around 9, Jenna grabbed her laptop and slid into the seat beside me. "Claire, we need to decide our next move. Regulators, journalists, law enforcement." I looked at the evidence spread across the table. All of the above, but not yet. First, we need protection. Evan glanced up nervously. "Protection? You mean lawyers? Lawyers, I said, and visibility. Jenna frowned. Visibility? I nodded. Franklin operates in the dark. If we go public even partially, it becomes harder for him to make us disappear quietly. Evan swallowed. Then we need someone fearless, someone he can't buy. As if on cue, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. My pulse spiked, but when I answered, the voice wasn't Franklin. Ms. Hart. This is Detective Marin from the Portland Police Bureau. I'd like to speak with you about a matter concerning your mother. My stomach dropped. My mother. Yes. But I'd prefer to discuss it in person. I exchanged glances with Jenna and Evan. Is this urgent? It is, the detective replied. After I agreed to meet her, she sent the address and office building downtown, neutral territory. When we arrived half an hour later, the lobby was bustling sunlight streaming across polished floors. Detective Marin, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, met us with a brief nod. Thank you for coming, she said. Please follow me. She led us to a private room with frosted glass walls. Once the door closed, she placed a folder on the table. I've been reviewing unresolved cases involving commercial land disputes, she began. Your mother's death was ruled accidental, but recent tips prompted us to reopen the inquiry. I felt my heartbeat in my throat. What tips? She studied me carefully. Reports of threats she received before her death. Concerns about retaliation. Someone implied the fall may not have been an accident. My skin prickled. Do you know who submitted the tip? We're still confirming that she said. But your name came up in the new activity logs. She paused. Ms. Hart, are you currently receiving threats behind me? Jenna inhaled sharply. Evan looked down at his shoes. I reached into my bag and slid Franklin's business card across the table, the one with the handwritten warning. Then the printed photo of me at the development site. Then the voicemail transcript. Detective Marin's eyes hardened. This is serious. That's why we need help, I said. And what exactly have you discovered? I opened my bag and pulled out one folder, the fatality review tied to my mother's signature. I didn't give her everything, not yet, but enough to make my point. Her eyebrows shot up as she scanned it. This should have been reported to federal safety regulators. It wasn't, I said, and my mother tried to expose it. The detective exhaled slowly. If this is accurate, multiple laws were violated. But right now, the most urgent issue is your safety. She turned to me fully. Ms. Hart, do you have somewhere secure to stay? No. Then I suggest protection, a safe house temporary relocation. No, I cut in quickly. If I disappear, Franklin wins. I need to finish what my mother started. Detective Marin weighed my words. She saw the determination in my expression. She understood. Finally, she nodded. Then we do this carefully, quietly. I'll assign officers to monitor your known locations and track the vehicles you described. Can you trace the SUV? Evan asked. We'll try, she said. But people like Franklin know how to operate off paperwork. Still, her involvement changed the equation. We weren't alone anymore. She stood. I'll need additional documents as soon as possible, but first I need to warn you, if you go public, the blowback will be immediate. That's the point, I replied. Her gaze sharpened. I hope you know what you're stepping into. I did. We left the office with a mix of fear and renewed strength swirling in my chest. As we walked back toward the parking garage, I could feel the shift, like a storm gathering behind clouds. But the moment I reached my car, everything inside me froze. A single envelope was tucked under my windshield wiper. My hands trembled as I removed it. The paper was thick, professional. Inside was a single typed line. Stop. This is your final warning. But the part that chilled me was the symbol stamped underneath. The Redwood corporate emblem. Bold. Unmistakable. Jenna swallowed. They know we met the detective. Evan stepped back. Claire, this is escalating. I folded the note with steady hands and looked toward the sunlight breaking through the clouds. "They want me scared," I said, terrified, silent. Then I opened the car door and tossed the note inside. "But I'm done being scared." Jenna placed a hand on my shoulder. "So what's next?" My voice was steady, cold, and certain. "We take the evidence to someone Franklin can't intimidate." I looked between them, feeling fire rise inside my chest. "We go to federal regulators." "And after that?" Evan asked. "After that," I said, "we take down Redwood from the inside." For the first time since my mother died, I felt something powerful, something that belonged to me. Momentum. We had turned the corner, and now the real fight was about to begin. The federal office building loomed like a fortress steel glass, and the weight of consequences humming in the air. I gripped the binder tight against my chest as Jenna and Evan walked beside me. Every step toward the entrance felt heavier, like I was dragging the past behind me with each movement. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A uniformed guard directed us to the Department of Environmental Oversight on the 4th floor. The elevator ride was silent except for the thrum of my heartbeat. When the doors opened, a woman in a navy suit approached us immediately, her expression brisk but curious. "Ms. Hart," she asked. "I'm Director Naomi Bishop." Detective Marin called ahead. I nodded. "We have evidence, documents my mother compiled before her death, and proof of internal suppression." Director Bishop led us into a conference room with glass walls and a long table. The moment the door closed, she gestured for everything we had. I opened the binder and spread out the fatality review erosion assessments, manipulated soil reports, internal logs, and finally the photograph of the collapse site I'd taken myself. Her eyes sharpened as she examined them. "This is extensive," she murmured, "and deeply concerning." Jenna added, "There's more digital files Evan downloaded. They triggered an executive trace." Evan swallowed. "Meaning Redwood knows someone accessed the internal archive. They might be destroying evidence right now." Bishop looked up sharply. "Then we'll need to act quickly." She clicked a button on the intercom. "Secure Team Room 4B. Bring digital forensics." Within minutes, 2 specialists arrived. Evan handed over his encrypted drive explaining every access point, every timestamp. The specialist nodded and moved efficiently, copying the data into secure servers. While they worked, Director Bishop turned to me. "Ms. Hart, your mother's findings should have halted the entire project. These conditions violate federal regulations, land use laws, and safety standards. If Redwood proceeded knowingly—" "They did," I said firmly. "I have Franklin Hale on record threatening me, admitting my mother was in the way." Her jaw tightened. "We'll need that recording. I have it saved. And the original voicemail." "Yes." She exhaled a slow breath of someone bracing for impact. "Then this becomes more than an environmental violation," she said. "It becomes a criminal inquiry." Jenna squeezed my hand under the table. Evan looked pale but steadier than before. Director Bishop pressed her fingers together. "Ms. Hart, I need to ask something difficult. Do you believe your mother's death was orchestrated?" A question I'd avoided for 10 years. "Yes," I whispered. "I do." For the first time, the room felt unbearably quiet. "We'll request the case file immediately," she said. "And if there was foul play, we will uncover it." A knock sounded at the door. An assistant poked her head in. "Director Bishop." "There's an urgent situation." Bishop frowned. "What kind of situation?" The assistant hesitated. "Security reports a group of individuals from Redwood Development is in the lobby. They're demanding to speak with someone. They're asking for Ms. Hart by name." My pulse dropped into my stomach. Jenna's grip tightened painfully. Evan looked toward the windows as if expecting snipers. Director Bishop straightened her voice, turning crisp. "We'll escort Ms. Hart to a secure room. They won't get anywhere near her." But before she could move us, the fire alarm shrieked through the floor. Red lights flashed. Sirens wailed. All 3 of us jumped to our feet. "What's happening?" I shouted. The assistant yelled over the alarm. Security breach. Someone's forced entry on the ground level. Bishop slammed the intercom button. Lock down every exit, nobody in or out. But the alarm continued blaring and a robotic voice echoed through the halls. Evacuate the building immediately. Jenna's face drained of color. This isn't an accident. Evan grabbed his laptop, shaking. They triggered the alarm to flush us out. The hallway outside erupted into chaos, staff running papers, scattering doors, slamming. Director Bishop grabbed my arm. Follow me. We're going through the internal stairwell. If Redwood is here, you do not let them take anything. We hurried down the back corridor, but as Bishop reached for her keycard, a deafening crash sounded from the far end of the hall. A metal door slammed open. Men in black jackets surged inside, 3, maybe 4. Not security. Redwood's private contractors. I recognized their insignia from the man at the cliffs. Go, Bishop shouted. We sprinted into the stairwell as heavy footsteps pounded behind us. Jenna cried out as a hand nearly grabbed her jacket, but Evan pulled her forward. We raced down flight after flight, the alarm echoing off concrete walls. On the second-floor landing, Bishop shoved us toward a door marked record storage. In here, she said. Barricade yourselves. I'll divert them. You can't, I cried. But she slid out the door before I could stop her, locking it from the outside. We pressed our ears to the metal. Shouting. Footsteps. The crackle of radios. Then silence. Evan whispered, She's buying us time. Jenna sagged against the shelves. We need a plan. Now. I scanned the dim room, rows of locked cabinets, narrow aisles, one small window high on the wall. We upload everything I said. Right now. To multiple places. Agencies, journalists, regulators. If Redwood wants to keep this quiet, we make it impossible. Evan nodded, pulling cables from his backpack. I can mirror the files to secure cloud dumps. But once I start, they'll know. Good, I said. Let them know. He sat up in the center of the room, fingers flying across keys, data uploaded in streaks of green light. Jenna monitored the hallway with her ear pressed to the door. My hands shook as I pulled out the last 2 items, my mother's handwritten notes and the accident report that wasn't an accident. I placed them on the table like anchors. Evan's voice broke the silence. First dump complete. Sending to federal agencies now. Dong. Journalists next. Dong. Law labs. Legal watchdog groups. Dong. Each confirmation sound was a blow to Redwood's secrecy. But then Evan froze. Someone's trying to breach the system, he whispered. They're remotely attacking the upload. I stepped beside him. Can they stop it? No, he said, but they can trace it. He looked up at me. They know exactly where we are. At that moment, footsteps thundered outside the room. Jenna gasped. They're here! The doorknob rattled violently. A man's voice growled from the hallway. Claire Hart, open the door! I shook my head, fear and fury coiling in my gut. No, I whispered. Not this time. The metal hinges screamed as someone began forcing the door. Jenna backed up. Evan stood beside me, shaking, and I steadied myself, feeling something ignite inside me that I hadn't felt in years. The strength of my mother. The door shuddered again, and again. They were coming, but this time I had the truth. And I wasn't running anymore. The door buckled inward on the next hit, the metal bending near the lock like softened clay. Jenna stumbled backward, crashing into a filing cabinet. Evan flinched at every blow, his fingers hovering over his keyboard, as if he could somehow shield the files with his own body. I stood in front of them, my bag clutched tightly to my chest, my breath shallow but steady. One more hit, and the entire frame groaned. Then silence. No footsteps, no voices, just a stillness so unnatural it made my spine tighten. Jenna whispered, "Did they leave?" A shadow moved under the gap of the door. Then another. I shook my head. No. They're waiting. For what I didn't know. But the tension in the hallway shifted, and then a voice rang out sharp and commanding. "Federal agents! Step back from the door." Jenna gasped. Evan exhaled so hard he nearly collapsed. A second later, the door burst open, but not inward. It was pulled from the outside, several uniformed officers flooding the room. Their weapons were raised, but they weren't pointed at us. They were pointed behind them down the hallway where Franklin's contractors scrambled to retreat. I watched in shock as the agents swarmed forward shouting commands. The black-jacketed contractors backed away, then bolted in the opposite direction. Within moments, officers chased them down the corridor, their shouts growing fainter as they disappeared around the corner. Detective Marin stepped into the doorway, chest-heaving hair windswept from running. "Claire," she said, her voice steady but fierce. "Are you hurt?" I shook my head, still frozen. "How did you know?" She lifted her phone. "Because you uploaded everything to government servers." And every federal red flag in the building went off at once. Behind her, Director Bishop jogged up, breathless but composed. "We traced the breach. Redwood's contractors violated federal property security the moment they stepped inside." She gave a tight smile. "They'll be in custody within the hour." Relief washed over me so suddenly my knees almost buckled. Jenna grabbed my arm to keep me steady. Evan just sat down on the floor, head in his hands, laughing shakily. Detective Marin stepped inside fully. "Your evidence is now protected. Your mother's reports the fatality documents, the digital files, they're part of an active federal investigation." Director Bishop nodded. "We will be issuing injunctions against Redwood's operations immediately. Franklin Hale will be summoned for questioning." Summoned. It sounded too gentle, but I let the words sit for a moment. The man who had stalked me, threatened me, destroyed my mother's career, and likely her life was finally going to face someone he couldn't intimidate. For the first time in a long time, I could breathe. Later that afternoon, the agents escorted us to a secure briefing room where they explained the next steps. Lawsuits, criminal charges, public safety violations, even potential manslaughter charges tied to the concealed fatality reports. But the moment that stayed with me was when Detective Marin placed a small folder in my hands. "My team reopened your mother's file," she said softly. "And based on the new evidence, we are now treating her death as suspicious." My throat tightened. "Suspicious?" She nodded. "We can't say more yet. But what you uncovered may change the entire case." Jenna squeezed my hand as tears blurred my vision. Not sorrow this time. Not even anger. Validation. My mother hadn't died in vain, and she hadn't been wrong. She had been silenced. But not anymore. When we finally stepped out of the federal building, the sun was low, casting gold across the street like a path leading forward. For the first time, that path felt mine to walk, not the one Redwood forced on me, not the one defined by grief or fear. Outside, reporters gathered, having caught wind of the evacuation and arrests. Microphones pointed our way like a barrage of questions waiting to happen. But before they approached, Detective Marin turned to me. "You don't have to speak," she said gently. "We can shield you." But I stepped forward, because my mother had been silenced, and I wouldn't let them silence me too. I told the reporters everything about the cover-ups, the false reports, the threats, the files Redwood buried. I spoke my mother's name clearly, so the world would know who she was, what she fought for, and what they took from her. By the time I walked away from the microphones, Jenna and Evan fell into step beside me. Both looked exhausted, terrified, relieved, and proud. "What now?" Jenna asked. I looked toward the fading sun. "Now," I said quietly, "we build a future they can't destroy." Over the months that followed, Redwood Development collapsed under federal investigation. Franklin Hale was indicted on multiple charges, including obstruction and conspiracy. Several board members resigned. The project was frozen indefinitely. As for me, I returned to my mother's cliffs, standing where she once stood, the wind carrying the ocean's roar to my ears. I closed my eyes and whispered into the air, "I finished it, Mom. They'll never bury your truth again. and for the first time in 10 years I felt peace. My journey wasn't over. Healing never is. But the weight I had carried alone for so long had finally lifted, and I knew what came next. Justice. Then rebuilding. Then living. Before I left the cliffs, my phone buzzed with a message from Jenna. "You're trending everywhere. People want to hear more of your story. You should share it. All of it." I smiled faintly. Maybe I would. And if you've stayed with me through these twists, dangers, and revelations, thank you. Stories like mine deserve to be told, and voices like yours help them reach the light. If you want more journeys of justice, truth, and resilience, stay with this channel, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter we uncover together. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't destruction, it's truth, and the courage to keep telling it.